So I would like to introduce today's speaker, and that is Simon Rolph from Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust. He is the Data and Monitoring Officer for them and will be talking to us about their current ongoing project and monitoring and data. So over to you, Simon.
Thanks very much. Great. So I hope you can see my screen then. So yeah, thanks for having me, Beck, and the FSC team. So my name's Simon, and so I work at the Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust, and I'm part of this project we're currently running, actually called More Data for Nature, because you can never have too much, apparently. And I wanted to just give you a bit of an overview of, I'm not really going to be talking so much about the specific work we're doing as part of this project, but give you a bit more of an overview in terms of biological records. How do they fit into how conservation charity works in terms of trying to understand our reserves and our local area, some of the challenges that we face and how you can help. I don't say that I'm know everything about this. It's a very complicated world. There's lots of stakeholders, but I just wanted to give you a bit of an insight from how we work at Sheffield and Rotherham, what we're trying to do and where we're trying to move and how you can help. So there we go. There's the quick aim of the talk. Why records are important. Appreciate some of the challenges and ways that you can really use the skills that you're maybe building up through some of the FSC courses to species ID to sort of put that into conservation work. The wider context for what we're trying to do here is this under the premise of what can be termed as an ecological emergency, or just a general concern about the state of nature in the UK. So the State of Nature report in 2019, this pulled together a lot of data and came up with a pretty strong conclusion that the abundance and distribution of the UK species has on average declined since 1970, and they also say that pre-1970 there's also been a decline. And there's been no let up in the net loss of nature in the UK. But how did they know this? And we come back to biological records. This was one of a very important data source that they used in putting together these state of nature reports. So I kind of want to talk about why these records are useful and how you can help. So the basics, I feel like if you're at this talk, you probably are aware what a biological record is, but just making sure everyone's starting from the same place. Biological records contain basically 4 key pieces of information about a species record. So it is what was seen and what can be. It can be down to the species level, or it can be a bit broader. So you saw a plant. Obviously that's quite broad, but that's what the what information captures. The where is where was the captured, and again this is could be quite broad, in the UK, but also very exact to a particular grid reference. When was a record recorded? It's also very important information for the basis that we would only expect to see some species in certain places at particular times of year. And then who recorded it? Now, this is the one piece where you're like, okay, well, surely this data is about the ecology and not the person who's recorded it. But that's very important in terms of verifying a record. It's always useful to have contact with the person who recorded it to then go back to them and check or query anything about the record. And so that's one biological record, these 4 pieces of information. But over the years, the UK has a long history of biological recording, and this has collated, enormous data sets of millions of records. But this is an incredibly useful resource in terms of informing conservation work or more wider ecological work. So why is this information useful? One of the kind of easiest ways to see how it's useful. So say a species action plan is a sort of a conservation tool that we use in order to look at the condition and monitor and try to protect a particular species. And so it's very useful to know, where is the species? How many of them have been seen? When have they been seen? And also the sort of data about, when as part of the biological record is important for understanding their natural history. So for an insect, maybe there's a particular date at which they emerge. And it's very useful to have that information. Because when we're putting together species action plans, we want to get as much information about the species, and it really helps us think about, okay, where can we change the environment to benefit the species, and where can we target conservation interventions. So that's I feel like is what quite sort of logical step. Okay, we've got species data and we're doing a species action plan. So we're working with one species here, pull all the data about it. We know where it is, how often it's been seen, and we can feed that into maybe just practitioner knowledge about the reserve manager. They might not have got concrete data, but they'll have observations about where the species is being seen and so on. So then if we want to move to the next step, so thinking about not just one species, but the biodiversity as a whole. So if we're looking at, say, one of our nature reserves at Sheffield and Rotherham, we can then pull lists of species that have been found on this site. And then we can use that to look at the biodiversity. Is it a very biodiverse site? Is there a lot of interesting and distinct species? Or actually, maybe it's more a quite restricted taxonomic range. Maybe one plant species dominates the environment rather than a more classic wildflower meadow, which maybe we'll be aiming for, which have a lot more biodiversity. So we can sort of collate biological records for multiple species to try and understand this sort of wider picture about the community that exists within our nature reserves and beyond. There are also some other kind of interesting uses for biological records in terms of conservation and ecology more broadly, with climate change resulting in earlier springs and hotter summers, and we're actually seeing species being able to expand northwards in terms of where is a suitable habitat for them. So but we don't know how fast this range is expanding without the biological records to back it up. So when we see a record that's outside of its typical range and it's northwards, then often it could be due to this tracking, due to climate change. And then another very pragmatic use of biological records is for tracking invasive species. So again, invasive species, we don't know where they are if we don't have the data. And invasive species are sort of things, if you let them establish, then they can spread through the ecosystem, especially along rivers with species like Himalayan balsam. And in order to maintain the habitat as it was before the invasive species, we need to know, like, as soon as possible, when a record has been recorded of that of an invasive species within a particular site, so that we can act on it. We can't act if we don't know. And biological records and recordings of schemes are a very suitable and well-designed tool to do that, because it captures those precise pieces of information, and it goes recording online will mean it will reach the relevant authorities faster. So that's kind of a bit of an overview about why biological records are useful for conservation. But when we scale it up to working with millions of records, it takes a lot of work, and it's very much a statistical challenge in terms of how do we make sense of all these millions of records, and that sort of effort results in really great reports and resources. So at Sheffield and Rotherham, in 2018, we published our State of Nature report for Sheffield, where we sort of tried to take a local approach of the national State of Nature reports, try and pull in all the data we can, and understand the state of nature in the area, and where are areas of conservation concern, and where are areas where we're actually doing all right. And there's other tools like the NBN Atlas, the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, which is slowly moving towards being a bit of a sort of one-stop shop for biological records, and it's a resource that we use a lot at Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust, and we've worked with the NBN Atlas, and they're very supportive of us using it and seeing it as this sort of resource that people go to in the first instance. We need to know what species are in this area. We can go to the NBN Atlas because it collates data from all sorts of other sources, from local record centres, from iRecord, from our Nature Counts database that we submit records to. So it's a lot of work trying to make sense of all this data, but it's very much worth it in terms of synthesizing this. But there are a couple of key challenges that we really face when we're trying to do this, and this is stuff that we faced when putting together the Sheffield State of Nature report. So there's a couple of so you may have heard of taxonomic and spatial biases. So I'm going to talk a bit about those, and there are some things relating to data flow about how quickly you submit a record, how quickly does it meet, does it end up with someone who can use it like a wildlife charity. And also these records are being recorded by people, and people don't do what you expect them to do always. They have their own preference in how they record. So there's all these sort of different factors that you have to match up when you're doing these sorts of analyses, trying to interpret the data. So taxonomic biases, I'm sure we're all quite aware of this, but a simple pie chart from the NBN Atlas really brings home the sort of biases that we're dealing with. 65% of records on the NBN Atlas are birds, but we know there's such enormous diversity of species, of which FSC run such wonderful courses on, invertebrates, and Kieran's here, and he loves his worms, and there's all sorts of different. There's such biodiversity, but the records don't reflect that because of people will maybe prefer to record birds. And so this is a challenge when we're trying to look at underrecorded species and trying to understand them. Often there just isn't the data for that species, and so that can really be quite a big barrier in terms of how we can use this data for conservation. And if just an example, if we look for robins and on the NBN Atlas, we've got 4.2 million records, and the whole of the map of the UK is this lovely brick red colour for accepted, verified records. And then we compare it to a nice earthworm here. We've got 908 records across the entire UK, and there are huge gaps in the map where there aren't. This species hasn't been recorded. So the challenge is, and another thing that doesn't help the issue is that at the moment, where you submit a record does make a difference in terms of where it goes and how it's used. And I'm not going to say where you should or shouldn't record, because there's all sorts of factors. But some things to consider is the where you submit your record. Do they have like a data sharing agreement with local conservation organisations such as local wildlife trusts? Does your provider, does your record centre or wherever you submit them, do they publish their records on the NBN Atlas? Because as the NBN Atlas kind of moves towards this sort of massive resource that people go to, if they're not on the NBN Atlas, then often they might get missed. There's other things in terms of how quickly will it be processed, and if you send a list of records by email to your local record centre, that will take longer than if you submit it online on iRecord or similar platforms like that, because it's immediately in the databases. There's no extra lag in there, so it will reach organisations that can use your data for conservation or otherwise. And also, it's something I won't go into, but there is an issue about what license does your record have when you're submitted it, and different record centres or different records hosts will submit their records under different licenses. So at the moment, it does make a difference. I kind of see in future maybe it will make less of a difference, and as things get a bit more joined up. But at the moment, yes, it does make a difference. And if you're really, if you're feeling particularly keen about understanding where species data goes, here's a very in-depth report. It's not light reading, but this is, I did have a read of it, and this is kind of where that previous slide talking about where the fact that where you submit does make a difference at the moment. It's very interesting, but it's also very long and probably not very interesting to the average person. But there is this interesting report. And the final thing with working with these biological records is they are submitted by people, and people have different preferences. And so this paper published last year, it tried to make sense of that. So this is a scientific paper published in a journal, which was primarily using, I believe it was iRecord records. And there were kind of three different ways in which people would vary in terms of where they record. So, some people record on this first column, either very small areas with, they'll have a core area with their records, but then they'll also maybe go beyond it. Maybe they'll record quite a large, across quite a big area. And then on the other hand, you get recorders that only record very locally. And then there's other ways in which people vary in terms of, some people record on one site, or just their garden or their local nature reserve a lot. Whereas other people will record on all sorts of different sites. Maybe they're traveling around a lot, and they're a regular recorder. So there's different aspects there. And then there's also people's where they record in relation to how big their core area is, as opposed to how big their maximum area that they'll go to. So some people have quite a big core area where they're doing a lot of their records, and maybe they'll only occasionally go beyond that. But then in other cases, someone might have a very localized core area, but actually travel quite far in terms of their records. So this is just another way that this biological records data can be quite challenging to work with, because of, if you think about so many factors going on in terms of what shapes the data, and why, if we see a species in one place and not another place, there's all these factors that contribute to that. Because if it kind of comes down to this one crucial point in terms of a record. So if we go to somewhere where there are no records, is it because this species is absent? And there's very concrete examples, like if you go to the middle of the land, then you wouldn't expect to see a dolphin. But there's less clear-cut examples. If we go to this area on that map where that earthworm hasn't been recorded, is it because it's absent, it isn't there, or is it simply because it's not recorded? And this can make it very difficult to interpret long-term trends. So say a species has been recorded, consistently for a couple of years at a site, and then suddenly it's not recorded. Is it because this was one person who was regularly recording it, and they've decided actually they're going to, their daily walk is now somewhere else? Or is it actually because of the biodiversity decline that we observe? Maybe it has actually gone absent, but it's very hard to make the case either way when we're not sure, and that's why we have to consider all these factors when interpreting these records. And I would say it can be very difficult to interpret long-term trends. But there are a few ways that that you can kind of help this. So obvious examples are if you want to look for underrecorded species or underrecorded locations, and I'd say the best way to do something like that would either be, you went to the NBN Atlas website, and you can do a spatial search where you draw a polygon around your area, and then it will give you lists of species in the area, and you can say, oh, actually this species hasn't as many records, but I know it's there, and you just have to go out and submit the records. Sometimes there's a case where people kind of assume that we have the data, but often we don't. That biodiversity data is, I think, a lot poorer, especially in underrecorded groups, than people would expect, considering how many people might be going out. But a lot of people might be going out might not be actually recording and submitting them to databases. And yeah, again, in terms of maybe there's locations which aren't being recorded as regularly. So maybe the nature reserve might have a lot of records because people are going out there on little field trips. But maybe a field a mile away might actually have some interesting records in it, but it's just not being recorded because people aren't going there. And I'd also ask you to consider, thinking about where you submit your records. If you submit to a local record centre, you can ask them, where does your data go? Because a lot of them are really great in terms of partnerships with the local national trusts. Some of them, the local record centres, are wildlife trusts. So and I've also got a little asterisk because so the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, there's this project coming at some point called Decide, which is looking to sort of automate this idea of targeting recorders to particular areas where there aren't species. So I'm excited about that, and I'm sure you might be too. And this was the sort of challenges that we faced at Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust when we were putting together the State of Nature report. And actually, our capacity for these sort of big statistical analyses wasn't that great. So we're kind of tackling it on a different angle, where instead of recording, we're monitoring. So the difference being that you're doing so you've produced a protocol or a method that you're repeating every time you want to do it. And this makes it so much easier to compare from one year to the next, because in the previous year that you did it, that you did look for this species, but it was absent. But this year you have looked at it and it is present, because you did the same protocol last year. You've got a lot more confidence in that change. You can't. It's much harder to attribute it to, oh, a recorder was in this area on this date, and so actually it was the record, but they weren't there last time, so maybe it was that, or maybe it was just because of people weren't recording this species. So this is kind of where we've come to in terms of, if we want to understand the condition of our reserves, we really have to shift our focus to monitoring and monitoring it. Actually, I don't know if you're familiar with recording, maybe you're aware of them, but the idea of absence records. So obviously we traditionally think of records as going and seeing a species there and recording that species. But absence records are where you record that it is not there, and it's almost more valuable because it gives you this sort of yes and no rather than just lots of yeses. So it seems like a slightly strange thing why we're recording that something's not here, but absence data is just as valuable as presence data. And doing monitoring standardized protocols gives us the sort of framework to collect absence records and help us look at the long-term trends. So yeah, this is kind of where we've been going, and I imagine a whole range of other conservation organizations across the Wildlife Trust movement and more broadly are kind of moving towards this sort of idea of evidence-based conservation, where the conservation work that we do isn't just based off, some ad hoc knowledge about, oh, this person said this, but we're using data from biological records. We're using evidence from, scientific literature. And so our kind of what we've been doing is, so we published a State of Nature report, key finding that we needed to have better data to help us understand the natural environment. This kind of rolled into what we called our Data for Nature project, where we set up nature counts as our sort of monitoring and records databases. We had a lot of records on spreadsheets, which of course are not doing anything for conservation more widely. And if you've got records on spreadsheets, it's a great resource for you. But in terms of records helping conservation, they have to be shared across the sort of biological recording infrastructure through iRecord or something. And then it leads to the project we're in now called More Data for Nature, where we're trying to move beyond our reserves and think about how can we collect data and monitor it on a sort of wider scale. And we're thinking kind of long term on this. So we've put together like a rolling monitoring program for all our reserves. We're monitoring everything from birds to rush pasture to grassland fungi to harvest mice. And what we're monitoring is very sort of targeted in terms of it's related to our different nature reserves. But this kind of builds us up an evidence base, and we're using a very similar skill set to biological recording. We're going out identifying, but we're just sort of refocusing on how we're doing it. We're not just doing ad hoc Azure records, we're doing structured monitoring, which gives us sort of this extra value for each biological record, because it's much better contextualized within monitoring data. So we've set up Nature Counts as part of this. This is sort of our biological recording database for us, for Sheffield Wildlife Trust. So Nature Counts is very similar to iRecord, and in fact the data is hosted on the same BRC Biological Records Centre database. If you sometimes go to a biological records center, biological records website that isn't iRecord but looks similar, it's often because they're built off the same open source platform called Indicia. So NatureSpot is another example of that. So we're using Indicia to build our Nature Count site. But instead of just recording casual records, we've got this added functionality for monitoring data. So the records are part of so this is the exact same data flow as happens with iRecord. So the data is hosted in the Biological Records Centre. The BRC do a lot of work in terms of making sure it's accessible by local environmental record centres. It goes through the iRecord verify system, and it also transfers data to the MBN Atlas, where anyone can then see what we hold and where our data, and sort of puts it in the wider context of other data providers. But as well as just biological records on nature accounts, we've set up so we can host these protocols for our surveys, so that we've got big groups of volunteers that lend their amazing ecological knowledge to help us be able to monitor our reserves. So we've got space on the website for protocols, and then instead of just biological recording forms where you're capturing the full piece of information about a record, what, where, when, and who recorded it, we're able to build these custom survey forms where we can collect all sorts of other information. So you can see in this example, for this is looking at woodland condition, we've got a list of species, and then with each of them we're actually asking, is it in the canopy, is it in the understory? For invasive species, what's the species cover of it? So instead of just a record and where it was, we've got this whole host of other data surrounding it within this sort of standardized protocol, which means we can kind of track things in the long term. And that's just really the strength of monitoring as opposed to sort of traditional ad hoc recording. And so this is what we've been working towards in terms of incorporating monitoring into our conservation work. And it's just a couple of examples, but I would very much encourage you as people who are, you're here with the FSC, you've probably got recording skills on particular taxonomic groups, or maybe you're just getting into it, or maybe you're kind of interested in the sort of conservation angle of it. But I would really encourage you to get involved in monitoring programs as opposed to just recording, and maybe ask your local wildlife trust if they've got sort of monitoring, or you could even, if there's a site you regularly visit, you could start doing your own sort of monitoring program where you can then track over time. And that you can then feed that information into your local authority or whoever manages this site. So we've got the pollinator monitoring system scheme. We've got UK butterfly monitoring. We've got the breeding bird survey. The value of monitoring is just is really quite powerful in comparison to biological records, because we can kind of detour around all these issues about who was recording it, or taxonomic biases and spatial biases. Of course, we still have our own similar issues, but yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to leave you on, thinking about the value of monitoring, how you can use the skills that you may be getting in terms of from just recording on iRecord or similar systems, and getting involved with monitoring can really help conservation charities understand the long-term trends in the ecology of their local environment. So thanks very much, and I believe that's the end of the last slides. There we go.
Perfect, thank you so much. So if anyone does have any questions, I'll ask you just to virtually raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself and come and ask Simon a question. But whilst we wait for that, we'll go to Dan for any questions from the chat.
Yeah, so we just had one from the chat that I can see. Yep. So Steve has asked, how can you be sure that a species is absent from a site rather than just not found?
Yeah, an interesting challenge and an interesting question. And there's no real easy answer. So, for example, how I think it's quite, you have to clearly define the sort of remit of your absence record. So, how we've been incorporating absence records into our monitoring program is we work on quite strict grid-based surveys, and so this grid square is small enough that we can exhaustively look at it and mark it as as absent. But yes, equally, you know, you could come back the next day and maybe it would be present. But it is an interesting challenge. It's the sort of thing that when you look at a presence record, and you see, okay, this species has been observed at this site. You have to apply the same thinking. You can't assume that means this species is there forever. You can't assume it's there all the time. You can't assume that it's in local areas. And when you look at an absence records, you similarly can't assume it is absent forever, or for, you know, a long period of time. You can't assume it's absent in, you know, it might just be in the grid square over. So I think as a result of this sort of slightly conceptual challenge, there aren't very many absence records really at all on like the NBN Atlas, because they're sort of interesting, trying to think about, you know, how can you be sure? But yeah, so it's an interesting challenge, but that's kind of the things you have to consider when you're trying to record absences.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for that. That's good.
Does anyone else have any questions? If you do, if you would like to virtually raise your hand and unmute yourself and come and ask, or if you don't feel comfortable coming on, you can put them in the chat and Dan will ask them out for you.
Just to clarify something, Simon, so I've got a question. I noticed on your data flow diagram for nature counts that it looked like the data went into iRecord and back out. So am I right in assuming that all of the records that go into nature count go to the various experts and specialists for various different groups in iRecord? So essentially, although it's a different system, they work very closely together and use the same record verification system. Is that right?
Yeah. So it was when we were considering, you know, we were faced with the challenge. We've got a lot of biological records, but they're not on a biological records database. Where do we want to host them? Where's the most appropriate place to put them, and how can we make the most of it? We very much kind of lean on the Biological Records Centre, the BRC's infrastructure, and the iRecord. So yeah, our data, whilst it goes through, you kind of think it like almost like a portal. You know, our website is a portal, but it very much sits in the same database as the iRecord data sets. I mean, there's some sort of differences. You know, if you make an account on iRecord and make an account on nature counts, you can't see them separately. But in terms of what we wanted to do, in terms of being able to capture this monitoring data, which is more than just records, it made sense to use the basis of a biological records system on the base, because when we submit the monitoring records, you know, we're still generating the same species records and still feeding into the same, you know, the national monitoring, national recording schemes for the different taxonomic groups. So we didn't want our monitoring data to sit on like a custom Excel sheet. That would be great, but it still wouldn't, you know, it's sort of, we've tried to work out, so we're doing best of both. But yeah, in terms of clarification, think of it as like a portal to a similar data set, and it goes through the same iRecord verify system.
So yeah, so just to clarify one thing as well, just in case people didn't pick it up, that means that anybody who puts data through your nature counts portal, as well as the Record Centre and the Record Centre and the Wildlife Trust are the same thing, really, aren't they? As well as them having access to it, all of the relevant national recording scheme will, if they engage with iRecord as well. So it means that people only have to send it one place, which is great.
Yeah. And as I said, the nature counts is very much only Sheffield and Rotherham area, and it does, like, I admit it, in some ways it kind of confuses things, you know, adding another data portal. But the sort of people we're targeting is being quite effective in we've got like lots of volunteers that, you know, are familiar with us as the Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust, and they're familiar with wildlife, but they're not traditional recorders. You know, they wouldn't think of going to iRecord. And so if someone comes up to us and say, you know, I record with iRecord, and I've been doing it for a long time, should I submit to nature counts? We can quite easily say, no, you don't need to, because actually we can access iRecord data because we're sort of on the same shared infrastructure. But the nature counts has been quite effective in terms of targeting the sort of different demographic of people who are into their wildlife, but aren't, you know, don't see themselves as recorders. So that's kind of the sort of motivation behind this sort of approach.
Yeah, thanks very much, Simon. I think it's great, absolutely fantastic.
Perfect. Does anyone else have any further questions?
No, we've got quite a bunch today.
Yeah. No, that's
Has anybody got any questions about biological recording where it's something they'd like to do, but there may be, if there's anything that's worrying you or anything that you'd like clarified, now is a great time to ask somebody like Simon that is heavily involved in it, and he can maybe give you some tips or hints.
Hayley, I can see that you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I'm a bit obsessed with recording. I'll be honest with you, it's quite addictive once you get started. But yeah, so I'm a senior ecologist, so I'm recording species as part of my job all the time. So I access a lot of areas that general members of the public won't have access to. Some areas that we get into are absolutely hidden gems. So I actually find, so obviously while I'm out trying to do my job, if I see incidental records of stuff, I'll take photographs and upload them later. And I do use iNaturalist. Now I know people have their opinion about iNaturalist, but I find it's very good for retrospectively remembering the specific location of that species. So when I get home in my own time, I upload them all onto iNaturalist and it'll pinpoint where that species was. But what I do, I suppose it's more of a suggestion rather than a question, is I'm able to download a Excel spreadsheet with all those records on, which I then forward to the local record centre where I was at the time. And I find that really useful because I know with recording, if you're a beginner, it can be quite daunting because there's so many different platforms and there's a lot of species actually that people just don't know what they are. I mean, I come across stuff all the time that I don't know what it is, you know, and I think that does put people off. So I think we are getting better, but I think, you know, the tools in supporting people to record, you know, I think there's still a little bit of a way to go. But yeah, I just wanted to check. So if I'm sending you guys over at the Record Centre an Excel sheet with my records on, I tend to do them quarterly. Is that still useful?
So yeah, I think it probably will be useful, and they will do whatever they do with their other records. You know, an Excel sheet is better than, you know, someone emailing a list of things, you know, because often these tools, whether they're on a sort of you know, with iRecord or whatever system they're using, you know, uploading spreadsheets is probably a functionality they will have. In terms of iNaturalist, yeah, it's kind of, at the moment, it's very much an emerging tool, and the sort of biological recording and traditional data flows are like suddenly, I mean, not quite sure what to do with it. But the NBN, the National Biodiversity Network, are moving towards sort of thinking about the ways that iNaturalist data will end up, so you won't have to do that. But yeah, it's sort of case at the moment, it doesn't really, and so, you know, us as the Wildlife Trust, we don't currently access our iNaturalist records, but they are actually all available, so it's sort of something we're trying to work towards, but these things kind of take time. But I imagine, yeah, uploading sending spreadsheets, then, you know, that means sure that it does get to.
Yeah, I always check with the local record centre if they do have access to iNaturalist, because some use it, like Eco Record, for example, in Birmingham use it, and I know that some local record centres don't. So I send over the Excel sheet, which has got all the data on, and I know that's probably not ideal, but because I'm accessing these places where are probably seriously under-recorded,
yeah.
And obviously due to my limited time, I think, you know, those records are better than no records. So yeah, but no, it's a good webinar. Thank you.
I think, Hayley, just to add to what Simon said there, I think something that's important for any recorder is it's about who your priority is in terms of who you want to see those records, because there are lots of organisations that you can send them to. So if your main purpose is to get them to the local record centre, then forward them on is great. I think it's worth noting with iNaturalist, because people kind of sometimes, they're like, should I use iRecord? Should I use iNaturalist? I think it's important to note that iRecord was set up by the Biological Record Centre for the recording schemes, and it's been adapted so that all record centres if they choose to, can download their data from it. All data goes through that formal verification process. With iNaturalist, it's all about crowdsourcing the verification, so it doesn't go through experts. And as far as I'm aware, most national recording schemes will never get that data. So it depends what you want the data to be used for. If you want it to be used for national atlases and monitoring, then iNaturalist may not be the right tool for that. You'd have to check individually for different recording schemes. So, and that's why I'm personally quite a big advocate for iRecord, which I'm sure Simon knows and many other on this call will. It's because of the flexibility, how it can be used and supported by local natural history societies, by record centres, but also it's set up to make the lives of the national recording schemes easier, and they're often volunteer run, so they're quite often a pinch point in our biological recording data processing network.
Yeah, no, I absolutely get my point, but obviously because I work in massive construction projects, a lot of the times you'll get hotspots, obviously, where those volunteers are recording, and that's great, but it might be sufficient distance away from the site that we're about to construct on, and therefore, and you know the same species of where you're currently stood. So yeah, I know it's got its flaws, but at the moment for me, it's quick, and I can produce an Excel sheet and I can forward it on into the hands of the relevant people, so those records are there. But yes, I do use iRecord when I've got leisure time, but for the speed of iNaturalist, it's one of those things. But yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how, you know, in maybe 10 years' time, it won't really matter where you submit it because it will be more joined up, or maybe we'll still be in a similar situation. So
that's the dream. That's the dream.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm with you.
So, I mean, we got any more questions?
I had one sent privately to me. Oh, actually, I've got two. So we've somebody said the confusion for her is always where is best to send records. So it's very similar, particularly to make sure they're recognised as part of the planning process. So if you're collecting records that you want to make sure are included in the planning process, Simon, where's the one place that you could send it?
So the planning process will be you know, we'll go through the local record centre, and they don't all access records from iRecord. So I would say if you're interested in that, email your local record centre and ask them, or email your local authority the process that works with that, and get clarification on that, because everywhere is different and they all have their different configurations. So that's my advice. Just go to the source and ask them how they process their data, where they recommend.
I have had a wild question from Steve. I don't even know where to begin with it, but I'm going to try it just for the fun, Simon, and it's quite a nice talking point, actually. He's asking, can iRecord accept species on basis of DNA or bioacoustic records? And from my point of view, I would assume that if those records are being, processed in a way by experts that would know how to do that, then they could essentially just go into, say, a spreadsheet and then upload it to iRecord. But I don't know if you've got anything that you would want to add to that.
So yeah, it is interesting thinking about biological records from things other than seeing the actual organization or the actual organism, because we've got emerging techniques like eDNA, which you can you just get a load of bugs and you blitz them together and then you just run it through a sequencer and it tells you what species you've got, and how can you submit those. So with bioacoustics, I mean, I know iRecord has that functionality because they support the bat conservation trust there. So if you submit records through the specific bat survey form, then you can attach audio files, I believe.
Also, the Grasshopper app lets you submit audio files as well, the iRecord Grasshopper app.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of, as default, it's not that functionality, but for different taxonomic groups where it's relevant, there is that option depending on the platform.
There we are. Turn myself off mute. I've got another question from Sam, who say, when setting up a monitoring program, typically what is the size of an area that you would want to attribute to a list of recordings? Is there a set size or guideline?
So I guess it kind of, there's a lot of things to think about in terms of, I mean, I can't really give a particularly good numeric value. I'm not that useful. But in terms of, it's worth considering that sort of how diverse the habitat is. So, you know, if you're looking at an area of woodland where it's very similar across the entire habitat patch, then maybe you'd be all right treating that as sort of one location, with maybe particular species that only occur in particular areas. Maybe you'd record them separately. But if you're looking at a nature reserve which has got you know, it's got some woodland, it's got some grassland, it's got some wetlands, then, you know, you might want to kind of break those down into those different areas and then sort of monitor them and track them separately. So for our nature reserves, I mean, they're pretty diverse in size, and the size kind of impacts, you know, the approach that you use. Are you doing more like a transect? Are you doing more of a point count? Are you doing sort of grid squares? So it depends what you're thinking about, but that's my sort of vague guidance, if that's useful.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, if no one else has any further questions, there will be a follow-up email sent, hopefully towards the end of the week, with the recording uploaded to YouTube, and also some links and direct information that you can access as well.